Good morning, everyone. On this overcast day, I have more voice than I had on Monday, so I'm going to try and get through a couple of videos for you here. I have decided not to do a video right away on Charlotte Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper because I get the sense that many of you are kind of still catching up a little bit. A few of us are a bit behind. It's a very, very heavy time of the term. Lots of us have different sort of, background life circumstances that have been a bit disruptive lately. COVID, for instance. And I did send out those reading questions to sort of support your sifting through and really engaging with the Yellow Wallpaper. So I don't want to kind of jump the gun and put a video out that's going to basically like tell you what to think before you've had a chance to make up your own mind about what you think. So yeah, if you haven't yet, work yourself through that story. It's not long at all. See what you can do with the reading questions. If you would like to discuss it, like if you've already done this and you'd like to discuss it, email me. If you want to send me, the answers that you gave to the different questions as you were going through and talk about them, we can do that. If you have different questions that remain unanswered, just basically reach out and we can kind of engage with this one-on-one. Otherwise, I'm going to wait a little while, until popular demand seems to indicate that it's an appropriate time to post on the Yellow Wallpaper, when and if. For this video, we are going to work on A Clean, Well-Lighted Place by Ernest Hemingway, and then the next video will pertain specifically to Mr. William Faulkner's The Bear. First things first, I have to apologize to the 2 or 3 students who were in our Zoom meeting on Monday because I misspoke a couple of times in that Zoom meeting, and I'm going to devote the first few minutes of this video to correcting kind of what I said there. So if you didn't watch the Zoom video, I would say don't. I think it's likely to confuse you. Just disregard. I think I might even take it down. Because we didn't cover very much ground, and in the ground that we did cover, I misspoke in a couple of important places. But regardless, if you were in that Zoom gathering or if you have seen the video, this will sort of correct some of what I said at first. A couple of the things I said in the Zoom video were based on my memory of this story, which I've read a few times, but for whatever reason, I think the very first time that I read it, which like you was in undergrad, and which was just, oh man, that experience clobbered me. This story clobbered me the first time I read it. And I formed a couple of memories about the story that are simply inaccurate, and what I was saying was based on those early memories about the story, false memories. I won't get into why I thought what I thought or why I misspoke, because that's just going to create a more vivid, like, wrong image in your mind. But the important thing is, I said in the Zoom video that the old gentleman in the cafe was blind. That's not so. He's deaf. I was incorrect. I knew that he had a disability of sorts where he was missing one of his 5 senses, and I remember thinking that that was really important, that it wasn't like he had a limp or he was missing an arm or something, but that he was missing one of his 5 senses. I think that is still an important thing to observe, is like what specific kind of, what is the quality of this man's disability? But in point of fact, and this matters, he is deaf, not blind. Yes. So, just sort of skipping down through my notes here a little to make sure that I don't overburden you with unnecessary information. So, because I was thinking blind, not deaf, I had talked about how it makes, the old gentleman a little bit messy. I said this in the Zoom class because I was thinking about the point where he asks the waiter for more brandy, and then he says a little more, and the waiter, what's the line? He pours into the glass so that it, where is it there? Yes, a little more, he says. The waiter poured into the glass so that the brandy slopped over and ran down the stem into the top saucer of the pile. Thank you, the old man said. I was remembering that as having more to do with the old man than the waiter, but yeah, it's in point of fact, the older waiter tries to point out to the younger waiter that this old man is actually very clean and neat and orderly and dignified, even when he's drunk. He's trying to point out to the younger waiter, trying to sort of impress on him that this old man, he's harmless. He's not bothering anyone. His sorrow, the sadness that he's brought into the cafe with him is not a mess or a nuisance or a plague or a noise that he imposes on the people around him. All he wants is to sit in a nice, clean cafe in this corner where light and shadow are playing across the table because a street lamp is shining through the leaves of a nearby tree. All this old man wants is a place where he can sit and be in as peaceful and respectable condition as anybody can be who is drinking heavily in the middle of the night. Like when the younger waiter says, well, he can buy a bottle and go drink at home, and the older waiter says, it's not the same. And the younger waiter knows, right? There's an enormous difference between drinking by yourself at home and sitting in a cafe where you're a recognized patron in public who just wants to pay for his drinks and drink quietly at his leisure, right? Both might be very sad, problematic conditions, but they are different in an important way that this story is sort of meditating on. So those are my reparations as far as I had initially misrepresented the old man. And it's all of it very important because in our Zoom drop-in on Monday, I will say Belinda very helpfully identified the presence of two interlocking foil pairings in this story. You'll remember we've talked in this course in the discussion threads chiefly about juxtaposition and how, juxtaposition is when you hold two anythings up together, well, two or more, in order to make a comparison between them. Usually it's to highlight their similarities, but often their differences sort of come out as a result, or, the purpose of the juxtaposition seems to be highlighting difference, but the similarities come out as a result. Usually there's a bit of both and. Whatever is foregrounded sort of paves the way for the other side of the coin to sneak up on you. So when I talk about, there are two foil pairings in this story, that's two instances of characters being juxtaposed together, held up close together for our compare and contrast reaction as readers. So the two waiters make one pairing, and the older waiter together with the older gentleman, they make the other foil pairing. And I want to talk about these foil pairings shortly, but first I want to address the absence of names in this story. This is a story in which nobody has an actual name. People only have descriptions, sort of outlines, even labels, right? The waiter, the old man, the young waiter, the older waiter. And the simplicity of these labels, waiter, old man, young man, drunk, insomniac, they invite prejudice, don't they? That's what labels do. They invite prejudice. They open up these little, in this story, very deliberately, they open up these little deceptive spaces, beckoning us to lodge all of our very first, most instinctive assumptions about the characters that these labels describe. But then, as we gain access to their conversations and their gestures, their thoughts, their backstories, we begin to have our assumptions and prejudices challenged, just as the older waiter is sort of challenging the younger waiter the whole time that they're closing up shop. So, gradually, I think these outlines that Hemingway uses instead of names take on a different effect than they had at first. Initially, they were these, labels that kind of make the characters vague and easy to judge. But over time, they make the characters common, universal, easy to relate to. They make them recognizable. The young, tired man with a wife to go home to is naturally impatient, and he is only like a million other young men with wives to go home to who are naturally impatient to leave work. Any reader of this story probably knows at least one such young man personally. The old man, who lives with grief and sometimes despair and is frequently drunk. He's only like a million other old men, and young men for that matter, who live with grief and sometimes despair, and who are perhaps frequently drunk. Anyone reading this story probably knows a middle-aged or older person, man or woman, very much like this. We know these people. They don't need names. They are exemplars of types that are so much more than just types, you know? They are individual people with individual stories, but they are also fragments of the eternal human condition. The older waiter sort of he underlines this himself with the last line of the story when he thinks to himself that his sort of existential angst, his particular sufferings, must not be anything especially grievous or rare. And the second part, you know, maybe they're not particularly rare. I think that's true, but does that mean they're not particularly grievous? I would strongly question that. But this is his line, you know, this is how he kind of says it. He says, after all, he says to himself, it is probably only insomnia. Many must have it. The last line of the story takes a lot of the conditions that we first associated with the old drunk man in the cafe, and he was singled out and sort of reviled by the younger waiter. He was othered, you know, he was portrayed by that young waiter as aberrant, abnormal, right? You know, what could possibly be wrong with him? He has tons of money. Why should he be sad? Why does he have to, you know, impose himself on the rest of us who have to work? What's his problem? He's so strongly othered in that way. But then, of course, by the end of the story, what the older waiter is trying to say, this man is common. He is one expression of many extremely common sorrows and pains and burdens. And he feels it in himself, you know? It's probably only insomnia. Many must have it. And it's that word only that we catch on, right? Many must have it. This must be common. Well, yeah, that may be so, and perhaps that's an important part of the lesson of this story. But only insomnia? You know? People use the word just in the same way. Oh, it's just this or it's just that. Stop justing. Stop onlying, right? Like that's just because it's common, just because a certain pain is not the worst pain ever felt by anyone ever, or the only pain of its kind, does not mean that it is insignificant or undeserving of compassion. But this is why that older waiter doesn't like to close up the cafe. Because what if somebody should need it? One of those people, those many people, whose nights are long and empty and wakeful, he understands that these sorrows are, to a greater extent that anybody likes to talk about, very common. So just for a sort of further thinking question, what else does it do to our experience of the story or the story's message, this avoidance of names? Because that's how we started this, is that there are no names in A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. Are there any other effects than the ones I've described, you know, where we go from label to archetype almost? Are there any other effects? And of course there are. Absolutely there are. So it's a somewhat rhetorical question. You know, think on it. But back to foil pairings. So first we have the two waiters who are held up to us as being kind of superficially the same, right? They do the same job. They probably wear the same uniform. Maybe in your head you were picturing two guys dressed very similarly. We might at first expect that they probably, you know, are of a similar age and stage of life, maybe the similar economic status. There are these assumptions that we have about waiters, serving staff. But then, of course, as we listen to them talking together and as we watch them interact with the old gentleman in the cafe, we begin to perceive that these two men are very different in several important ways. They're distinguished by age, character, circumstance, mentality, increasingly as we go along. One is younger. He has a wife. He works hard and he's tired at the end of the day, and he's frustrated when patrons keep the cafe open late because he wants to go home to his wife and his rest and all the other goodness and warmth that he has in his life outside of work. Later in the story, he talks about how he is all confidence. He has youth and he has confidence. He's portrayed as impatient, a little short-sighted, and on this day at least, deeply uncompassionate. He treats the old man with a callousness, even a bitterness, that is pretty shocking. By contrast, and again, now we're starting to develop the contrasts, right? Superficially, they're held up to us as being, similar. Are they similar? ? And then the contrasts proliferate. The older waiter has none of those things that the younger waiter has. He says that explicitly himself. One thing that I find really poignant, though, is that even though they work together, the younger waiter doesn't seem to know that. He says, well, you have everything I have, and the older waiter has to go, no, I don't. He says, I've never had confidence, and I am not young. He doesn't address the question of whether he has a wife or not, whether he ever had a wife, which makes a tantalizing little bit of mystery, in my opinion. I'd love to know what your reading instinct is. But it is really, it stands out to me that even though they work together, probably often, this young waiter doesn't seem to know a single thing about the older waiter's life. He's not paying attention. The older waiter, by contrast, is paying attention. If you watch the conversation that they have about the old man towards the beginning of the story, the kinds of questions that this older waiter asks are very perceptive and actually very scary. Some of them should concern us very much. When the younger waiter tells the older waiter that the old man had tried to commit suicide, he asks a question that could be morbid curiosity or could be genuine, sort of like, oh man, I just want to know. Like he asks, how did he do it? And the young waiter says, well, he tried to hang himself. He asks, the older waiter asks, who cut the old man down? The younger waiter says it was his niece. And then the older waiter asks, why did they do it? The younger waiter doesn't even blink at this question. He answers it, well, fear for his soul. Anyone who values their life would think that a very strange question to ask. Why did they cut him down? Why did they try to save him? Why did they stop him? That's a very strange question to ask. And it's a major little fragment of insight very early on into some things that we're going to find out about the older waiter's state of mind, the condition of his soul, the pain that he himself also lives with. Anyway, we gradually begin to feel that it's perhaps because of this relative lack or loneliness or emptiness in his own life that the older waiter has a great deal of patience and compassion for this deaf old man at the cafe, and for everyone like him. The older waiter, we learn, is very much like the old man in that he is also one of these tortured, restless sort of souls who doesn't want to go home and can't sleep and just sort of wanders the town at night. He is wounded inside by a pain, a grief that is difficult to name, and it makes him restless. Not in a driven way, not like teenage angst kind of restless, but more in a hollow way. Like a leaf that blows down the street. Maybe it catches here and there from time to time, but never really stopping, never at rest. At one point, the younger waiter says to the older waiter, "You talk like an old man yourself." That's our cue. That is our cue to shift our gaze now and consider this new foil pairing of the older waiter and the old man. We begin to see them as kindred spirits, sibling souls, even though superficially they appear to be far less alike than the two waiters would be to one another. So this is two instances of juxtaposition, in this case a juxtaposition of characters, i.e. two foil pairings. There's your key vocabulary. And we've now discussed two examples of what I would consider like major cues, major info drops that happen in the span of like a phrase, a sentence or less. That is really typical of the short story. The short story is an incredibly dense, efficient medium. Huge amounts of information can be communicated very economically. And there's no room for superfluous detail in a short story, right? Nothing is extra. Nothing that you read in a short story does not need to be there, because a really excellent short story, through the drafting process, the author has already taken out everything that is extra. So all of these seemingly idle questions in the conversation between the two waiters, they are not idle. They are telling you things. Right. Note also later on that when the older waiter wanders into a bar, just hoping to take up space for a while with a hot copita, which means like a little cup, think an espresso, his behavior is so mild and flat and incongruous with the place and the crowd at this time of night that the bartender thinks he must be a bit touched in the head. The bartender says, "Otro loco más." One more crazy. Just there's always another crazy this time of night. And suddenly we see the older waiter being treated by this bartender in a very similar way to how the younger waiter treated the old man back at the cafe. It's like the two scenes are echoes of each other, commentaries on one another. And that echoing effect excites our compassion as readers, because unlike the bartender, we have had access to all the emotional freight and buildup and unveiling of both scenes, right? We have seen and heard all of this stuff that came before. So the bartender knows nothing about this older waiter's life. He takes no pity on the fact that he's got nowhere better to be in the middle of the night than a bar, especially when all he wants is a drop of coffee. And that makes us think of the old man who privately had attempted suicide just a week before the day that we met him in the cafe. Would anybody seeing him for the first time guess that? And all of this creates a sense of what's called dramatic irony in the story, right? Where the reader knows something that the characters or some of the characters do not. We now have a sense of insight and perspective that the bartender does not. The older waiter has succeeded in bringing us into his compassion, his anticipation of the possibility of pain in normal-looking people. And that dramatic irony, it takes hold of you to the extent that like you almost want to shake the bartender in this later scene. You almost want to say like, open your eyes, ask some questions, act like this is a human being in front of you, act like you know that there is more hunger and thirst in asking for a cup of coffee than just wanting a cup of coffee. It's about so much more than a coffee, so much more than a brandy. It's not about that at all in some ways. I mean, it is, but it is about coffee and the dignity and the comfort of coffee, but it's not about coffee. It's about an emptiness inside that is so big, at times it seems to rewrite the world for the person who feels it, right? Go back to that part where the older waiter is rehearsing the Our Father, like the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary, but he's substituting all the key nouns for the word nada, which is Spanish for nothing. Our nothing, who art in nothing. Nothing is your name. That emptiness almost rewrites all the biggest things in the world, all these touchstones that people normally have in their lives. They just crumble almost into dust because of this force that we're conjuring within the story. What is it? What's the force? What's the pain? What's the cloud hanging over everything? It's difficult to name, but I think the story does name it. There's an interesting relationship in this story between the concept of nothing and the concept of despair. At the beginning of the story, when the younger waiter tells the older waiter that last week the old gentleman tried to commit suicide, the older waiter says, "Why?" The younger waiter said he was in despair. The older waiter says, "About what?" And the younger waiter says, "Nothing." "How do you know it was nothing?" "Well, he has plenty of money." Ugh, as if that's the only thing anybody could have to worry about. So, but let's take that little nugget there. He was in despair. About what? About nothing. Where else do we see the word nothing in this story? It's down there when the older waiter is rehearsing the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Marys and replacing all those key nouns with nothing, nothing, nothing. I'll try and read a piece of it. What did he fear? He's asking himself. This is the older waiter. What did he fear? It was not fear or dread. It was a nothing that he knew too well. It was all a nothing, and a man was nothing too. It was only that, and light was all it needed, and a certain cleanness and order. He's trying to say there are these sensory forces that for a time can seem to take the claws out of the nothingness, the feeling of emptiness and nothingness that plagues him. He says, some lived in it and never felt it, the nothingness, the meaninglessness of life, the emptiness of it all. Some lived in it and never felt it, but he knew it was all nothing